What's up guys, TechLab here. Now in today's video we're going to be taking a look at another older Nvidia graphics card, and this time it's in the form of this. This is actually a reasonably old card now, but I was completely surprised by its performance. So for those of you that don't know, this is the Nvidia Geforce GTX 970. I managed to pick it up super cheap recently for a build that we were doing. It was actually a £100 gaming PC build, and I paid around £32 for it. That's actually not bad for any graphics card at the moment, particularly one that can actually perform. And inside that system, it actually was held back massively by the CPU. We did only have a first generation Intel processor, which held it back completely, so we couldn't actually tell what kind of full performance you would get out of this graphics card. So instead, we decided to do some full testing with our proper test bench, and we did that. And this card is actually performing pretty well. The model that I actually managed to pick up is a Zotac model, and it looks pretty smart, to be honest. I was quite surprised at how good this card looked, particularly for its age. It's about 9 or 10 years old now, so we're talking about nearly a decade old card here, but it actually looks fantastic and it looks reasonably modern. And as well, it's actually made out of metal. There's no plastic shroud on this one. We don't get a back plate, but we do get a front metal shroud, which probably doesn't really add to any kind of cooling effects, but it does look pretty cool, and it means that the card is pretty solid as well. This card in particular comes with everything you need. It's quite a compact card. It's got dual fan system. We do have a DP connection, a HDMI connection. We have 2 DVI connections, a little bit old now, but in case you've got an older monitor, it does require 2 6-pin connections, which is generally not that hard to find nowadays, particularly in most systems, because if you've got 1 6-pin connection, you tend to have a little pigtail for the second. But underneath the covers, we've actually got a pretty decent graphics card. This particular card sits on an architecture of a Maxwell 2.0. It has a base clock speed of 1050 megahertz. We have 1664 shaders, and it comes with 4 gigabytes of GDDR5 memory. 4 GB in 2024 is probably not that good, but for a budget card like this that roughly cost about £32, you can't really complain, because a lot of new cards still come with 4 GB, or at least in the last generation as well. It has a memory bus of 256-bit, which is a good thing for this card, because it does mean that we're going to get some pretty decent performance out of that memory. And it has a memory interface of a PCI Gen 3.0 x 16. The average TDP on this card is only 148 watts, which actually means you can run it off some pretty low power supplies, and it was released in around 2014, which of course makes this card nearly 10 years old. It originally released for around $329, which doesn't sound too bad, to be honest, particularly with the performance that you still get on this card. And I kind of think that anybody that really did actually opt for one of these cards back then really did actually get something that was pretty decent. You've got something that would last. We know that the GTX 980 Ti lasts because we've tested that previously, but I wasn't expecting the performance that I got from this one. The first game in our testing was Back 4 Blood, a game that I did actually take out of my test suite but swiftly returned, as I do find it has been a great game for testing older hardware. And a game like this really does go to show what something like the GTX 970 is still capable of. Simply setting the game to a 1080p resolution with a high graphics preset, we saw an average of 71 frames per second, with a 1% low of 35. This meant that the game was more than playable and kind of set a standard for the testing going forward. The low 1% lows could be increased if you wanted though, by simply lowering the graphics preset to a medium or a low setting, but I really didn't find the need to enjoy this game. Next up is of course Dead Island 2, a reasonably new title that is not only one of my favourites from 2023, but also one that is pretty reasonable set of minimum requirements. Configuring the game with a 1080p resolution, lowering the graphics preset to a medium, and enabling FSR2 with a quality setting not only allowed us to play the game quite well, but it also maintained a lot of its visual quality. Here we saw an average of 71 frames per second with a 1% low of 35. Now that 35 may sound low, but it really didn't contribute to any issues on screen, which is always a bonus to these single player story driven games. The next game is another favourite of mine from 2023, and that game is Hogwarts Legacy. Now this game is pretty huge, to be honest, and it has tested many graphics cards that have come across my hands, but quite surprisingly this little GTX 970 actually did quite well. Remaining with a resolution of 1080p and lowering the graphics preset to medium and enabling FSR2 with a quality preset, we managed to get an average of 60 frames per second with a 1% low of 47. This actually quite surprised me, if I'm honest, as I expected worse, and even though enabling FSR here did take away a bit of sharpness from the picture, it was actually still quite pleasing to the eye. I could play this game all the way through with this card at these settings, and I'm sure there are many others who could too. Now a new game to our test suite, and one the GTX 970 is first tested against, is Robocop Rogue City. A late release of 2023 makes it one of the newest games we have tested, and even though on the surface it doesn't look like it would need a lot to run, the game actually really does need some horsepower behind it. This is shown within the performance we saw from the GTX 970, which wasn't completely terrible, but also not that great. To get this game to be playable with the GTX 970, I had to run the game in a 1080p resolution with a low graphics preset, and I had to enable FSR 2.2 with a balanced setting. With this configuration, the game didn't look that bad, but we could only achieve an average of 30 frames per second with a 1% low of just 19. Some would say that you could still play this game with this kind of performance, and to be honest, you probably could, due to how slow paced and cinematic the game is. But for true fans of the concept, it's not a sacrifice you really want to make. In Spider-Man Remastered, we managed to get a pretty decent average here of 64 frames per second with a 1% low of 46. And this was quite achievable by simply setting the game's resolution to 1080p and lowering the graphics preset to just a medium setting. Even at these settings, the game looks great and it runs quite smooth, so it is almost definitely one that you can play on the GTX 970. Starfield, as usual, was one of the worst performing games in our testing. Running the game in a 1080p resolution with a graphics preset of low and enabling FSR 2, you could just about squeeze 30 FPS on average. This of course is not ideal for a game of this size, and unfortunately the low 1% lows of just 20 did mean that there was a few stutters here and there, but if I'm honest, performance wasn't really the biggest issue. With these settings, the game looked terrible and really did not provide a good looking cinematic experience, and this is probably one that you should avoid for now with this card. Quite surprisingly, we could actually get a playable experience in The Last of Us Part 1 with the GTX 970. Over time, this game has become easier and easier to run, which suggests they are patching it and optimizing it through updates, which is great to see, as it does mean that people with cards like this will get a chance to play it. Running the game in a 1080p resolution with a low preset and enabling FSR 2 with a balanced setting, the GTX 970 managed to get an average of 47 frames per second with a 1% low of 32. It meant that the game was quite playable and didn't suffer any major performance drops or stuttering, so quite a win here for the older graphics card. Now, from the performance we got in our testing, I would actually suggest that this card is still a pretty capable card, and it kind of shocked me a little bit because I was expecting a hell of a lot worse. I kind of assumed that the GTX 980 Ti that we recently tested was kind of like an outliner because it was a flagship card and they generally last a bit longer, but I think this one's actually holding up quite well as well. Of course, there is some controversy around the amount of memory you do actually get with these cards, because technically it is 3.5, even though say it's 4 gigabytes, but it's just because it uses the memory in a different way. I'm pretty sure anybody buying at this kind of range in price is not really going to worry about that as long as they can play games, and surely enough, this card can actually play those games. I'm not exactly sure what I'm going to be doing with this card next. I am adding it to the collection, and I'm sure you might see it in some builds going forward. It's actually quite a good performer, and I think it would make a great esports title card now because it is still supported by Nvidia for the drivers, and to be honest, you're going to get a pretty decent performance out of it. Let me know in the comments below if you have a GTX 970 and what kind of games are you playing and what kind of performance are you getting out of it. Are you still happy with the card, or are you now looking to upgrade, or if you've actually had one in the past and what did you think about it? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you want to see more content like this. We do have a number of other graphics card kind of catch-ups to coming, so you will want to watch them, some from AMD, some from Nvidia, so we've got something for everybody. And I'm sure, as always, we'll catch you guys in the next one.